Hello and welcome to Dogs with Torches. In this episode, we are joined with the esteemed medievalist and historian of medieval women, gender, and sexuality, Dr. Ruth Mazo Karras, to discuss the social conceptions of marriage and sexuality during the Middle Ages. Dr. Karras is a scholar of medieval women, gender, and sexuality. Her books cover topics such as slavery, prostitution, masculinity, and quasi-marital unions. She's interested in the intersection of social and cultural history, legal history, the history of women, gender, and sexuality. She has worked with a wide variety of sources, including court records, hagiography, and Icelandic sagas, to name a few. She has a particular interest in medieval masculinities and in the way particular stories are retold and reinterpreted across times and geographies. Before coming to Trinity, Dr. Karras taught in the United States at the University of Pennsylvania, Temple University, and the University of Minnesota, where she was named Distinguished Teaching Professor for her work in teaching postgraduates. Along with countless articles and book chapters, some of her monograph work includes Doing Unto Others, Sexuality in Medieval Europe, From Boys to Men, Formations of Masculinity in Late Medieval Europe, and Common Women, Prostitution and Sexuality in Medieval England. Dr. Karras, thank you so much for joining with us today.
Thank you for having me.
So I figured we'd just dive right into sort of setting the stage regarding sexuality as a social phenomenon in the Middle Ages. When it comes to medieval gendered conceptions of sexuality and intercourse, what would you say are some of the main differences to how the Middle Ages understood sex apart from our own?
Well, one thing is that people today, I think, tend to regard sex as a mutual activity. For the most part, people today think of sex as an activity that two people do together. Now, of course, there are some sex acts that only take one person, and there are some times where three or more people are involved in something. But for the most part, it's a paired activity. We don't think most of our, let's say, intransitive rather than transitive. It's something that you do with someone, something that you do together, something that we, plural, do. And in the Middle Ages, it was much more understood as something that one person does to someone else. And you could still see traces of that in some kinds of discourses that people have today. But not in the majority. I had a scholar review some of my work once and said, how can you talk about such and such activity being considered a sin for women because the men who were doing it with them were doing the exact same thing? And I was like, this person so totally does not get how the whole thing was structured, because they didn't, particularly if a woman is a sex worker, okay, the man and the woman are not doing the same thing. They're even if they're involved in the same physical act, their roles in it are very different, and their moral culpability could be assessed very differently.
Right. But would it be fair to say that it was very much medieval sexuality swung on the axis of the active and the passive participants in sex acts, or is that too simple?
I mean, I think that's basically it. I mean, the reason it's too simple is because active and passive don't quite cover it, because, in certain acts, one person may just lie there and not do anything, and the other person is the one who is physically active, but that doesn't map onto the active and passive distinction. I think the best way of thinking about it is the penetrator and penetrated, which has a lot to do with reproductive ideas as well as ideas about sexual desire.
Right. Going off of that theme of reproduction, well, maybe we're jumping ahead a bit. Another thing I wanted to maybe ask is, would it be a good idea to draw a distinction sometimes between how the ecclesial authorities and the church saw what was considered illicit intercourse versus how sexual activity and even marriage played out in an everyday life?
Absolutely. And I'm glad you said ecclesiastical authorities and the church, because the church is, it's a really broad term, and you may consider that it includes everyone. I mean, the vast majority of people, were members of the church. But there are lots of different sort of centers of authority within the church, and there are theologians and canon lawyers in the universities who are writing rules, or church councils who are legislating, not necessarily according to what the theologians thought
Right.
was appropriate. And then there are the church courts who are enforcing the legislation of the councils, but again, maybe not entirely in the way that it was intended. And then you have your average parish priest who is counseling the people who are coming to confess to him and assigning penance for different things, who may understand things rather differently. And then you have the average believer. So you've got lots of different understandings of what the rules are. And then you have also a certain level of not caring
Right.
what the rules are that have come out of officialdom.
Right, right. I remember a while ago we had Dr. Eleanor Yanaga. She came on to discuss some of the themes that play out in courtly love literature. And one of the things that she discussed that sort of drove home this point was that sexual activity was something that you were expected to fast from the majority of Advent and the majority of Lent. But if that was actually taken seriously, then that would mean that no one was born during large swaths
Yes.
of the year.
Yeah. There's a book by James Brundage that's basically an overview of the canon law of sex during the Middle Ages. And unfortunately, I lent my copy to somebody who left town in March of 2020 and needed it for her research, and I never got it back. Otherwise, I would show you this lovely flow chart he has about sex according to the penitentials, and it has all these questions. Is this your wife? Is it a Wednesday? Is it a Friday? Is it a Saint's Day? Are you naked? All these
Right.
other things. And then the vast majority of the arrows point to this big sign saying, stop, sin. And the circumstances under which you could have sex if you followed all the rules that were promulgated would be, well, first of all, just the days would be less than half the year. And then if you also take out any times when the woman is menstruating and all these other things, it it was very seriously limited, and the chances that everybody followed that are really kind of minimal.
Right, right. And then actually going off of what you said regarding the penitential manuals, how much do these manuals give a window into medieval sexuality? I mean, one of the concerns that you raise in your book is that we shouldn't draw on them too much because it's how the ecclesial authorities
Yeah.
view sexual activity, not necessarily how it's playing out.
Yeah, so the most detailed of the penitentials, it gives specific tariffs for different things. These are from the early Middle Ages, and they're mostly written as punishments for sins by monks, although some of them are directed at lay people. They're also, I mean, it's kind of hard to lump them all in one because some of them were very much influenced by the Eastern Church. Some of them were Irish. Some of them were English and continental. It tells you something about attitudes, but for example, the penance for eating fish that is found dead in a pond and the penance for a man who has sex with another man
Mm.
are the same. Now, does that mean that, and it's a reasonably heavy penance, does that mean that there was a category of people in the Middle Ages called pescabartuarians,
Right, exactly.
who were considered really serious sinners? Well, no, I mean that found its way in there probably because of a specific occasion that somebody
Right.
had thought was important enough to write a penance for it, and then it just got copied over and over. But that's a sort of a sign as to why you can't just say this is a transparent window into what is going on in
Right.
people's minds.
Right. And then another question I wanted to ask is how exactly did the Middle Ages divide sexuality? One of the things that I know that Foucault harps on a lot in his works is that we shouldn't take the provisional categories that we use in our day-to-day life in the contemporary world and transmodify them onto previous societies because it's just anachronistic. And in contemporary parlance especially, we speak about sexuality as comprising homosexuality, heterosexuality. Was this division at all present in the Middle Ages, or what can you say?
I mean, I wouldn't say it's totally absent. I think their categories tended to be quite different. I think that the big distinction in the Middle Ages is between sex that is reproductive and sex that isn't potentially reproductive. And so sex acts between men and women that are not reproductive are sort of just as bad as sex acts between two men or
Right.
two women. But there's some nuances and complications to this. For example, sex acts between two women often aren't punished very heavily, and often I think they're not considered sex acts unless there is what people in the Middle Ages would have called an instrument involved. Uh, I think sex was so connected with reproduction that it was thought to require penetration, and anything else was just what we might call foreplay.
Right. And there's also another division of distinguishing what was considered licit and illicit sexual activity. There, of course, is the question of reproduction, but there's also the question of whether or not there's any sort of consecrated virginity or vows or questions of chastity in the chaste
Yeah.
life.
Yeah. St. Augustine said that, it's not the case that marriage vows make all sex illicit. And he said that, in fact, if you're going to have non-reproductive sex as a man, it's better if you do it with a sex worker. I mean, that's not his term, than with your wife, because you yourself are already corrupt. And you might as well not add to that sin by corrupting your wife. And so do it with a woman who's already corrupt. So if you are having sex for other than reproductive, marriage does not make it okay. And according to Augustine, marriage makes it worse. I mean, Augustine was very, very influential on thought about marriage and sexuality in the Middle Ages. That particular passage is not one that's quoted as often as some others,
Right.
but it certainly was read. I mean, his work was really influential in this area.
Mm.
I mean, the other thing, Christianity is different from other religious traditions in that it thinks that lifelong chastity is a good thing for as many people as possible. And some other religious traditions have a very small number of people for whom chastity is recommended, but they generally encourage marriage and reproduction among the general population. Right. And Christianity in the Middle Ages preached pretty consistently that marriage was not a lesser evil. They were pretty clear about that. And this is drawing on Augustine again. Marriage is not the lesser of two evils, that being marital sex and non-marital sex. Marriage is the lesser good of virginity. Well, actually, there's three: virginity, widowhood, and marriage. And marriage is the third.
Right.
But so Augustine says it has to be considered good, but it's not as good as virginity. And so lifelong chastity was the ideal, but it's an ideal that very, very few people could actually be expected to achieve.
But even within those divisions, there's kind of limit cases where there are men or women that live in one sort of social sphere that try to or want to gravitate to another sphere, perhaps of virginity or consecrated life. I had a while ago, Anthony Bale, he came on to discuss Marjorie Kemp. And there's a really, one of her themes is how she wants to cut off her husband, John Kemp, from the marital debt and live her life as a consecrated virgin. And allegedly, she writes about how she had this vision of Christ appearing to her saying, you're going to count one day as one of the virgins. Yeah. I'm going to interpret it. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's okay for you to wear white.
Right.
There's a very nice story. This gets retold in a lot of manuals for preachers in the late Middle Ages of a priest or a monk. I mean, it varies depending on who's telling it, but he's visited by an angel who says that, I'm going to let you see now which of the people in your congregation are sinners. And there are married women there who he sees have halos and are shining brightly, whereas some monks are not. And he's saying, how can these women who have been soiled by by sexual activity be more virtuous than these monks who maintained lifelong chastity. And the angel tells him that these women have done all these good things. They have made charitable donations. They have cared for the poor and all that. And they had sex with their husbands only at their husband's request and never based on their own desire. Whereas these monks, even if they have never had sex, they have had impure thoughts, which these women never did. There is this strand of thought in the Middle Ages that says that physical virginity is not what matters, and it's what is in your soul that matters. And it's not just minor strand of thought. I mean, there's a continual argument that, yes, married people can go to heaven and that they can be virtuous. And particularly in the 12th century, when there's sort of a challenge from groups who get classified as heretical, who say that all sex is bad, the church has to come back and say, no, actually, reproduction is good.
Right. And there's also so many, one of the thematic, there's a very strong thematic presence in hagiography about dramatic conversions from sex workers, Mary of Egypt, or for example, and those were extremely popular, as I understand, during the Middle Ages.
Yes. I mean, Mary Magdalene, who was understood. I mean, the Bible doesn't actually say this, but she was believed to be a reformed sinner. She is the second most popular saint in medieval Europe in terms of church dedications after, as you would expect, the Virgin Mary. And she is, I mean, you can see why this would be very popular, that she was someone who had sinned seriously, but then who had repented and become very beloved by Christ and an important saint.
Right. All right. Some groundwork with respect to medieval sexuality. We've discussed, themes of chastity. But I figured maybe now we could discuss medieval marriage. How much of the medieval understanding was shaped by ecclesial sacramentology, and how much of it would you say is shaped by socio-political phenomenon, for lack of a better word?
I mean, I wish I could say, 37.2%.
Sure, I know. Just rough, yeah.
These things are not entirely separable, and it becomes kind of a chicken-egg question, because is the teaching of the church influenced by social patterns, or does it influence social patterns? And the answer to that, I think, has to be both. And it's been argued that the big change between classical period and the Middle Ages was not just through the enshrining of chastity for everyone and the idea that carnal relations were bad, but also a certain measure of equality, that, both men and women were supposed to stick to one partner, rather than, women, if they're going to be considered virtuous, have to stick to one partner, but men, having more leeway. I mean, men continued to have a bit more leeway, but not in sort of official teaching.
Right.
There was more of a gender equality.
Interesting. I mean, it's interesting that you point that out, because as I understand it, one of the engendered conceptions that's popular during the Middle Ages is to view women's sexuality as more voracious in appetite than men. Would you say that's fair?
You certainly find that in some discourses. You'd find that in literature, for example, in the French Fabliaux. I think in theology, what they would say is not so much that women's appetites are more voracious than men's, but women are weaker and therefore less able to restrain their appetites than men. And that's one reason why yes, Eve can be blamed for the fall of mankind because she was tempted and ate the fruit. But Adam has to be blamed too, because he is stronger than Eve, and he should have told her, no, we can't do that, rather than going along with her. And so his fault is just as great or greater. So it's not, yes, it's not very egalitarian to say that women are less blameworthy because they're weaker, but that was a very general aspect of medieval beliefs about gender.
Right, right. And then another thing I wanted to ask with respect to marriage is what exactly was the understanding of consenting to marriage? Because as I understand it, much of like the canonical emphasis on marriage stressed that consent was kind of a necessary precondition for the possibility of marriage. What exactly did that look like, though?
So there was actually some debate about this during the 12th century, and the position that won out by the 1170s was enshrined in decretals of Pope Alexander III and remained the canon law of the church sort of ever since, is that marriage is made by consent of the two parties. It's not made by consummation, and it's not made by the payment of dowry or anything. It's made by the consent of the two parties. And the church really did enforce this. So if somebody said that they were forced into marriage either by their partner or by their parents, or they were too young to consent, or someone was unable to consent because they were mentally ill, they could not be married. There is a very interesting case from 15th century England that we know a lot about because it was a family whose letters survived. So this is a Paston family, and their daughter runs off and marries the bailiff. And the mother is very, very upset at this. And she's writing the son, mother's widowed at this point. Her son is away. And she's writing to her son about it, saying, you have to come home and do something about your daughter or your sister. The mother goes to the bishop, who's a friend of theirs. This is a gentry family, and says, you have to declare this marriage between my daughter and the bailiff null. I don't approve. And so the bishop interviews the two partners separately to find out, exactly what words they said to each other. Then, and the daughter says to the bishop, here are the words that I said, and if these aren't the right words to make a binding marriage, then tell me the right words and I'll say them right now. Okay. And the bishop goes back to the mother and says, I'm really sorry. I would like to be able to dissolve this marriage, and it's really terrible that your daughter went and ran off without consulting you. If they have agreed to marry, and that's it. And it also, marriage up until the 16th century, marriage did not have to be performed by a priest. It commonly was. I mean, you would exchange the vows outside the church. You'd be blessed by the priest, and then you would go inside the church and hear mass. But that's how you're supposed to do it. And you're supposed to also make it public by issuing bans, that is, for 3 consecutive Sundays before the wedding at the church. The priest will announce that these two people plan to marry, so that anyone who knows of a reason why they should not marry can come forward and say so. So you're supposed to do all those things. But if you don't, if you just exchange vows, just the two of you, that marriage is valid and permanent, just as if it had been done at the church. And the problem that arises from this is a problem of evidence.
Right.
So if you didn't do it in public, then one person says, yes, we did exchange these vows, we consented, and the other one says, no, I never consented.
Right. Well, doesn't that also, there's also another problem that I think you allude to in your monograph about how there was kind of a thorny issue of conditional marriages. If we go to bed together, I'm going to marry you, or something along those lines, that then becomes an issue in legal court, whether that was a form of consenting or that wasn't.
Yeah. So a marriage that is made in words of present consent is immediately binding. A marriage that's made in words of future consent, which could also be considered a betrothal, it's binding but not as binding. So you can't just say, okay, I've changed my mind, I don't want to marry you anymore. Right. But if the couple goes to court and says they really want to marry each other, the church court can dissolve it. But if after the exchange of these promises, if the couple has sex, then it becomes binding. And so you get a lot of court cases about this where there were promises of marriage with one person, and then you did the full marriage at the church. Right. Present tense vows with another person, and which one is the valid marriage. And it basically comes down to um, were the promises, future promises followed by sexual intercourse? If
Right.
so, that kind of changes it into present consent.
Okay. Interesting. And then, okay, speaking off of consent, and maybe we could discuss briefly about how sexual violence and rape was viewed in the Middle Ages. I know this is a very much a thorny and sensitive topic, but how exactly did medieval society understand rape and sexual violence? As I understand, it doesn't quite graft onto how we see it today.
So, I mean, today, consent is really sort of the key issue. And I'm sorry to say that in a lot of cases, um, in the Middle Ages, the courts didn't care that much about consent. And especially, if a woman did not physically fight back so that the rape can't be said to have taken place via physical violence, then a claim would not get anywhere. And there's also, part of the problem is, and partly because woman's consent, didn't matter that much, that the same term can sometimes be used for what we would call rape and what we would call maybe kidnapping, but it's not always kidnapping, because if a woman consents to run off with a man, but her family doesn't consent, that could be called raptus, which is the same word that's used for rape, except we wouldn't call that rape
Right.
because she consented. But that allows historians to say, oh, well, we don't know if this was really rape because it could have been,
Sure.
just
Right.
marriage without the consent of her parents. And I think the vast majority of cases that did constitute rape, we don't know about. There's always, that's certainly the case in the courts today. Sociologists talk about a dark number for rape statistics because more than any other crime, it goes underreported. And I think that was probably much, much more so in the Middle Ages.
Right, right. Another problematic that's kind of in the background is with respect to, again, another engendered conception of sexual activity, that it was assumed that pleasure was sort of a necessary condition for the possibility of pregnancy.
So this is something that is disputed medically. So you can find medical treatises that say that a woman has to experience pleasure in order to become pregnant. And this could be a good thing because it encourages men who want to have children to make sure that their wives experience pleasure. But then you get to the issue of, can pregnancy be used as a defense against rape? She became pregnant, therefore she must have consented. But there is a strand in medieval medical thought that says you have to distinguish between the consent of the body and the consent of the will, that the body can experience pleasure unwillingly, and therefore a woman can become pregnant without consenting to it in her mind. And if her body experienced pleasure, that doesn't necessarily mean that she was mentally experiencing pleasure or that she mentally consented.
Okay. And then with respect to maybe transgressing sexual boundaries, I know we've talked about chastity and celibacy, and we've also discussed medieval marriage. With respect to what was considered transgressing these boundaries, such as adultery, was the social stigma uniform or isomorphic with respect to men and women, or can we find any evidence of a sort of double standard to how women were perceived?
There is definitely a double standard at some times and places. You see it, for example, Thomas Aquinas is still using a Roman definition of adultery, which is sex with a married woman, and where the man's marital status doesn't really matter. But if you look at what the courts are actually doing, in many places, they do take adultery by men seriously, although they don't always call it adultery. And there's also been work done, particularly by Shannon McSheffrey on medieval London, that among the bourgeoisie that you can see in the 15th century, that they were demanding a certain standard of propriety from the men as well as from the women, and that men who engage in extramarital liaisons were really frowned upon. There's a lot of variation, I guess, depending on where you are located in the culture.
Sure, sure. And then is there any reason I've had a really hard time understanding what courtly love literature tells us about this is the medieval society. Is it evidence of excusing or turning a blind eye, you might say, to adulterous activity among the nobility? Because adultery does seem to be a thematic, literary trope in courtly love literature. But what can that tell us about it?
I don't think it's so much saying that it's okay. I think you have to take courtly love literature as being a genre like, say, romance literature today. That there's a there's a certain amount of fantasy involved.
Sure. Okay.
And this is not to say that these kind of relationships didn't take place and that there wasn't a certain fascination with them. People, just as in romance literature, people are, depicted as doing things that, they know are wrong, but they're carried away by passion.
Okay.
Same thing that you find there. And there are lots of literary genres today that you could say they certainly tell us something about our society, but they're not mirrors in which we see our society reflected. And that's the same way I would approach a medieval genre like courtly love poetry.
So when we read about Tristan and Isolde or Lancelot and Guinevere, and we have this drive to root for them in fiction, that doesn't necessarily transfer onto how if that's played out in real life.
Well, look how they end up.
Right, that's fair. Yeah.
No, it's fantasy.
Okay, that's fair. I always thought it was interesting that Dante, when he places a lot of the courtly love tropes in his circle of hell, at that stage of the comedy, he's very, I don't want to say understanding, but he's very sympathetic to the souls trapped there, much more so than he is when he gets to lower levels.
Well, yes, they're not at a very deep level, but also look what he says about the courtly love literature. Francesca and Paolo are in hell because they were reading a book of Lancelot together, and that gave them ideas.
Right. Okay.
Or made them think it was all right for them to have sex together, and they didn't repent for it and ended up in hell.
Okay. Well, what about medieval social perceptions of unmarried sexual activity? So two people who are not married or not related to the consecrated religious life, was this activity seen as problematic or as concerning as adultery was? I would imagine that for aristocracy, with marriage in the question, there's all sorts of sociopolitical concerns at work there, whereas with unmarried activity, especially among the lower classes, it's not as much.
Well, so it could be, and again, for the Middle Ages, we're talking about 1,000-year period, and things change. But men of royalty and high nobility, it was sort of expected. Not expected in the sense that they were told they must do it, but nobody was surprised if they had a mistress either before marriage or during their marriage, because their marriage was going to be arranged, as you said, for sociopolitical reasons, and they couldn't really expect it to be a love match. Lower down the social scale, I think it varies a lot. It could be dangerous for women to enter a relationship and not be married, because then they would have no legal protection. They would presumably be living on the earnings of the male partner, but she would not have any right to his property or anything like that after his death. But as far as how they are treated socially within the community, you can find lots of examples from the Middle Ages where people, especially in towns, where people are not especially bothered about whether the people living next door to them are legally married or not, unless there's kind of a dispute between neighbors about something else, and then they may go tattling to the church courts about it.
I see. And then what can you tell us about the status of sex work in the Middle Ages? Was there any social class which was more prone to engaging in sex work over others? I mean, what can you tell us
Well,
about it?
there weren't that many jobs that were open to women. When women went to towns to look for work, the things that were open to them were basically domestic labor or sex work. And there are stories about women being deceived into sex work, thinking they were being hired for domestic work. But, as to, which people were most likely to enter into it, the people who needed money and didn't have another way of getting it. I mean, it was not, as today, there are a lot of, and let's talk specifically about prostitution or the exchange of sex for money, because sex work can include a lot of other things as well. But if we talk specifically about, money for specific sex acts, as today, there are high and low ends of that business. But the vast majority of people who engage in it would have been at the low end, and it's something that people did because they were in need. And it was something that women or men, although we have a lot less evidence about men as sex workers, but there's some. It's not something that they engaged in because they liked having sex. I mean, much as there's some medieval stories that thought that they did. You mentioned Mary of Egypt, and the legend of Mary of Egypt talks about how she had sex with so many men because she was just so lustful and could not be satisfied. But really, that's not why people in any period take up that line of work. That, again, is a fantasy, because people who hire sex workers want to think that they're having sex with an enthusiastic partner.
It's projection.
But it's generally not a very safe job, and people do it because it's the best of the available choices.
Right. And then another thing that you discuss in your monograph is how as a literary concern, there's anxiety about interreligious sex work activities. So a sex worker engaging with people or taking on clients from different religious backgrounds. What exactly was that such a concern or theme?
Well, I think it's a concern that comes down to, a question of dominance. So men can exert symbolic dominance over other men by taking their women. That's in quotation marks, taking their women. People didn't want their women contaminated by men of other groups. I mean, you can look at, in a more modern era, all the anxieties around, say, interracial sex. And it's also, David Nirenberg has argued that the responsibility of maintaining boundaries between Christians on the one hand and Jews and Muslims on the other was displaced onto sex workers. You have to, this is where we're going to draw the line that says these people cannot be members of the community, and it's your responsibility to enforce it.
Right. I mean, that is interesting how even with respect to sex work, which I'm sure, ecclesial authorities weren't too happy about its existence, there was still a divided line between what was considered transgressive sex work versus not licit, but okay.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the term that I like is sort of expected, like it's still wrong, but we're not going to make a big effort to get rid of it because it's just something that we expect to happen.
Right.
But you got to draw the line somewhere, and this is where we're drawing.
Okay. And then, all right, well, maybe I figured we could switch topics to discussing another theme you discuss in your book and is becoming increasingly of interest to medievalists is the topic of same-sex sexuality and sexual activity. What exactly was the medieval understanding of? We talked about a little bit about sexual activity of women between women, because as I understand it, it's very scant in the literature, and as you said, it almost seems like it doesn't count in.
Yeah, well, so here, I mean, I think the word queer as an umbrella term, again, it's not a medieval term, it's a modern category, but I think it's very, very useful. There's not a lot of medieval sources that talk about women having sex with each other, but there's a lot of love letters or poems and things between two women. There are clearly women in the monastery and outside the monastery who had deep emotional relationships with each other. And the question of were they having sex or not is probably not answerable. I mean, as a guess, I would say, yeah, probably some of them, but that's not really something that we can say. And there tends to be a bit of a double standard about it. That is, if a man and a woman are writing love poetry to each other, we sort of assume that they're in a relationship.
Right.
And if two men or two women are, then historians are very quick to say, oh, well, but that's just how people wrote in those days.
Right.
But so Judith Bennett has written about this and sort of coined the term lesbian-like, which she says, I can't say what they were doing sexually, but these women they're living in houses with other women. They're not marrying. They're involved in intimate emotional relationships with other women. We may not want to call them lesbians, but they had a lot in common. I have to say, I have just finished teaching for the first time a class called The Queer Middle Ages. For their last assignment, the students had to do a creative work, either retelling a medieval story in a modern voice or like writing something in a sort of medieval voice, medieval love poetry or something. And I got such wonderful pieces from these students, including, you know, medieval Arabic love. I mean, obviously it wasn't in Arabic. I wouldn't have been able to read it, but poetry in English that was kind of an imitation of medieval Arabic love poetry, but particularly using kinds of metaphors for both the speaker and the beloved that would indicate that they were both women, these kinds of things. And what really impressed me with the students as a group is the way they focused on the positive, like not on the oppression of people who engaged in same-sex sexual activity in the Middle Ages, because there certainly was that, but they focused on where there was space for love. And I know you're here to ask me about my research rather than about my teaching, but I think it's an example of research-led teaching, I guess. But I thought that the students really, really successfully engaged with the idea that the categories in which we think don't have to be the same in the present day and in the Middle Ages for people in the present day to feel some kinship with what's going on in people's lives in the Middle Ages.
I actually did want to ask that question because you raised it in your book when you're talking about literature that discusses intense love between men, and then, of course, the sort of sexual activity component to it. You raised a good, interesting point in your monograph that very often we get into the kind of habit about seeing sexual activity as like the highest expression of passionate love, so to speak. And was that necessarily how the medievals would have understood that? I mean, what was there room for conceiving of intense friendships without an accompanying like sexual aspect? Or is that a question we can't really adjudicate?
I think there's probably too much of a tendency to look for that in the Middle Ages.
Okay.
Because we've bought into what they have to say about purity and so on. On the other hand, there's a sort of a chastity is not just something that is imposed on people. I mean, for some people it is. For some people it is a struggle, and it takes work to overcome their desires, and they're considered to be virtuous for that work. But for some people, they were not interested in sex. And again, you don't want to say, well, these people were asexual in the modern sense because the reasons are different, the spiritual implications are different. But nevertheless, I think there were people who could have, and there are people who can have very deep emotional relationships that were not sexual in nature.
Mm.
And the difference is that in the Middle Ages, that was sort of held up as an ideal.
Okay, right, right. Okay, so when you're reading Aelred of Revolu's poetry and he's talking about intense love between men, would it be better then to sort of suspend the question of whether this takes on a sexual element, or what would a
Well, I
historian
mean,
do?
he specifically recognizes that some people may think it has a sexual element. So it's not like he's sort of blindly going along, well, everybody knows that I'm writing these letters expressing deep love, and everybody knows that we're just friends. As he says, some people may think that this love is too carnal, but God, who can see into our hearts, knows that it's not. And so that inclines me to think that he's sincere about this. But on the other hand, there's a possibility that he's saying, no, some people think us having sex is a bad thing, but God knows about it, and I haven't been struck dead yet. No, it's difficult to interpret.
Sure.
I tend to think that Aelred really did believe in a, I don't want to say non-erotic, but non-sexually active form of love.
Gotcha. Okay. And then I know this is a really, really complicated and kind of controversial question to ask, but even though a lot of medieval conceptions of sexuality view them more or less as a set of activities rather than a preference. I know you talk about how penitentials kind of drive forth the point that illicit sex was something that anybody could do.
Yeah,
It wasn't
right.
reducible to a
Yeah.
preference. But could you say at all that there's any sort of developed conception or correspondence to what we might call today an orientation, or is that just
Yeah, there is. And the best examples of this are from the later Middle Ages. I mean, well, the Central Middle Ages, you get literary examples where if a man, doesn't love a particular woman, she accuses him of only liking boys. Or in like medieval Florence, there's a book by Michael Rocchi. There was, again, this is an example of how we could get information about social practice from hostile sources. There was a special court set up to deal with accusations of homosexual activity. And there it was considered sort of normal for men tended to marry pretty late. And it was considered sort of normal for them to go through a period in their younger teens where they would have sex with older men and then from from the time became mature, grew facial hair, whatever, they would have sex with younger boys until they were all grown up and got married. But there were some men for whom it wasn't just a phase. It was something that they continued, even after they were married. And this was recognized and they tended to be punished worse. But there's also in medical writing, and Joan Cadden has a book about this, there was the argument that, I mean, quote unquote, sodomy is usually referred to as the sin against nature.
Mhm.
But there was this argument that for some men, being penetrated anally was completely natural. They are born in such a way as to be particularly sensitive and to receive pleasure in that manner.
Right?
And that the title of her book is a quote from one of these medieval medical writers. Nothing natural is shameful. So it's not just a question of what's natural according to, official rules, but what's natural for a specific person.
Right. Right. Interesting. Because I know that usually when there's questions of what's natural, it's usually based, as we said, on this axis of reproductive and
Yeah.
non-reproductive.
But it's very much, what what I approve of is natural and what I
Okay.
disapprove of is unnatural. Because, for example, if you think about, say, sex between people who have, a married couple who either, have been married for decades and not had any children, so you can assume that one or both of them are infertile, or where the woman has reached menopause. Nevertheless, sex between them is not considered unnatural. I mean, it's not reproductive,
Right.
but it's still done in the same manner as reproductive sex. When they discuss that, I mean, theologians say, well, it's all right because even though a child is not going to be conceived in this way, but you never know, and God could. And of course, that's true. If you believe in the Christian God, God could do that, but God could also cause a child to be conceived by a virgin.
Right.
God could cause a child to be conceived out of sex between two men if he wanted to, because he's omnipotent. So the argument, I don't think, holds up that well under strict logical scrutiny, but that really wasn't the point.
Right. Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Karras, for the interview. Maybe as a couple closing questions, how important would you say is the study of sexuality in trying to understand the Middle Ages as a whole? I mean, is it at all, I don't want to use the word anachronistic, but if we just zone in on this particular sphere of life as a thematic concern.
So,
Sorry.
I mean, I kind of see what you're asking is that how important is it to medieval history generally? I would say, well, in one sense, very important. I mean, a lot of medieval life centered around passing on a legacy to your children, whether it's a legacy of property or a legacy of teaching or whatever. But having children was really important for most people. And therefore, sexual activity is obviously a part of that. And for people for whom having children was not important, I mean, those who chose the religious life, the renunciation of sexuality is really central to that. And when you see medieval discussions of sin, it's very often assumed, and almost always assumed in the case of women, that sin is going to be primarily sexual. So it's still very much there. On the other hand, I would say that Caroline Bynum has made this point. She's a very distinguished medieval historian and who has written about the importance of food as symbolism in
Holy
the Middle
feast
Ages.
and holy
Yeah.
fast.
And she says that, food is so much more important than sex in the Middle Ages because people didn't have it, and you can live without sex more easily than you can live without food. And that the symbolism that because the modern age is so interested in sex that we make it the most important thing in the Middle Ages when actually there are other food, she would say, is more important symbolically. I'm not sure I would say more important. I would say I don't want to say that sexuality is more important than other things, but it's right up there because it bears so much on something that was just really part of daily life.
Right. I'm so glad that you mentioned Carolyn Walker Bynum, because it's very interesting that another phenomenon we find in the Middle Ages is taking a lot of these categories of eroticism and transmodifying them onto religious experience or hagiography or iconography and things of that sort. That you see not so much religious imagery being a typology for sex, although I'm sure that was there, but it's more so using sexual imagery to convey religious and divine experience. Or would you say?
Well, I mean, I think it works both ways.
Oh.
One of my favorite stories in this regard is from a 12th century English theologian who, in his early life, had lodged with a landlady who had a beautiful daughter, and he had a dream one night of him reaching into that daughter's bosom. And he woke up and said he had to go find another place to live because he was having these dreams of temptation about her. And later in his life, he founded a monastery, a whole monastic order, in fact, and she joined, and she became, a great teacher within the order. And he realized that this dream that he had was not to be interpreted literally as him reaching into her bosom, but rather as him reaching to her for wisdom, and she was going to be his teacher and so on. I mean, this is what I really like about this story is it reminds us that medieval people hadn't read Freud, and we might say, oh, well, reaching into the bosom that's clearly sexual. And he at the time interpreted it as sexual. But his hagiographer later is saying this is not, we look in religious imagery to find sexual desires. Rather, we look into sexual imagery to find religious desires. And that, another interesting thing to look at is medieval interpretation of the Song of Songs, which is a love poem. And it can be interpreted, in a very erotic manner. And that they made a real point of interpreting it allegorically, and that it's about the soul's love for Christ, the church's love for God, and so on. But they recognized that it could be a problem. And St. Bernard wrote a whole series of sermons on the Song of Songs. At the beginning, he said, you shouldn't let young monks read these sermons. You have to have people of mature understanding.
Right. All right, then. Well, maybe as a closing question, do you have any recommended readings or sources for those who'd like to learn more about sexuality and marriage in the Middle Ages? I know we've talked about your monograph, Sexuality in the Middle Ages, doing and others, but do you have any other recommendations?
Well, obviously that one. There's another overview of sex in the Middle Ages by Catherine Harvey. It's called The Fires of Lust. So it covers some of the same ground as mine and Catherine Pierpont's, but in a slightly different way. And I would say if somebody is interested in a more academic work and wants to know sort of what's the latest thing on medieval gender, I would recommend a book by Leah Devon called The Shape of Sex: Non-Binary People from Late Antiquity to the Renaissance. It's a very good book. It recently won an award for the best book in medieval studies, and in any area of medieval studies. And it opens up a lot of really interesting ideas.
Okay. All right. Well, Dr. Karras, this has been a pleasure. Thank you so much for coming on.
Well, you're very welcome. I'm happy to talk to you.